Hello and welcome to Press TV's Debate. I'm Marcia Hashmi. Thanks so much for being with us. BBC, CNN, and the New York Times and others are all fake news and the enemy of the people. This is according to U.S. President Donald Trump. Representatives of these organizations were barred from entering a White House press briefing. Now, the New York Times has called this an insult to democratic ideals. Well, what do you think? Stay with us as we take a look at all of this on this debate.
No end in sight to the war between US President Donald Trump and the media. This war intensified on Friday after the US president once again condemned the media outlets on his blacklist as fake news and an enemy of the people. Two derogatory phrases he has time and again used to batter the news organizations with which he has been at loggerheads during his month-long presidency and before taking the helm as president.
A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are. They are the enemy of the people.
Hours after his tirade, the White House barred several major news organizations from a press briefing. Reporters from the BBC, CNN, the New York Times, and several other news outlets were denied access to the briefing by US Press Secretary Sean Spicer. The Associated Press and Time magazine chose not to participate, even though they were granted entry. Meanwhile, journalists from several right-leaning news channels were allowed into Spicer's briefing, including NBC, ABC, CBS, and Fox News. The New York Times angrily reacted to the ban on the journalists' attendance at the news conference, saying nothing like this has ever happened at the White House. The Times called the move an unmistakable insult to democratic ideals. Meanwhile, CNN described it as an unacceptable development by the Trump White House. And the Committee to Protect Journalists also condemned the White House's move and expressed its concerns. Trump's row with the media started from his first days of campaign. He promised to open up America's libel laws to make it easier for him to sue news outlets who produce what he called misleading stories.
I think it's great that he's going after the mainstream media because this is the mouthpiece of the global oligarchy, especially the BBC and the New York Times and these types of organizations that pretty much socially engineer the world through propaganda.
The US president has repeatedly tweeted against the media and called them liars. In a recent tweet, Trump spelled out exactly who his targets are when he talks about fake news. He described a series of America's most famous broadsheet newspapers and 3 major TV networks as enemies of the people. Since day one of his campaign, when he announced his intention to become America's president, the media kept challenging Trump, asking questions and demanding an explanation for every single comment that he made. But as time passed, this turned into a war, and it seems that following Friday's media ban, the battle between the US president and those who he calls the fake news has entered a new phase.
Are you a friendly reporter? Watch how friendly.
Well, let's welcome my guest to the program from the Columnist, a columnist from The Hill, Mr. Brent Budowsky, out of Washington, D.C., an investigative journalist, Mr. Tony Gosling out of Bristol. Welcome, both of you, to the program. Well, let's start this off in D.C. and Mr. Budowsky, definitely interesting times. Now, your take on all this, calling these news outlets enemies of the people and fake news. What do you think of the U.S. president's claims?
Well, I think they're nonsense. I should tell the audience that the Hill newspaper, where I write a column for, was one of those newspapers that was not allowed into the briefing. We're in good company. I think the problem is that Trump doesn't like what the news is reporting, and he doesn't like the negative effect that it's having on his public relations and on his approval rating, which is very, very low. I predict that sometime by the beginning or middle of next week, on the matter of excluding reporters, I predict the president and his press secretary, Mr. Spicer, will see the light, and we'll have a happy ending, and everybody will be back in the briefings. I do think it is both dangerous and counterproductive to Trump and to any president to declare a holy war against the American media. The last president who tried anything like that was President Richard Nixon, and his presidency did not have a good ending.
All right, Mr. Gosling, isn't it true that it is easy for the mainstream media to actually control the narrative because just 6 corporations own 90% of mainstream media entities? Isn't this in itself dangerous for free and accurate dissemination of information?
Well, look, the mainstream press here in the West has got a tremendous amount of problems. Yes, it's in a tiny number of hands. Often reporters and journalists who ask awkward questions are simply elbowed out of the way, and you end up with quite a supine press who just ask soft questions. But what here is happening is Trump is accusing the people that don't agree with him of being fake news. It is, as the other correspondent said, this is a very dangerous move, very counterproductive move. In fact, in a way, I think Trump has shot himself in the foot here. Great to see Associated Press. In fact, when I saw that, I cheered. Associated Press and Time saying, actually, if you're going to start excluding the eyes and the ears of millions of people around the world from your press briefings, then we're not interested in your press briefings. And it would be nice to see the other organizations, the big US TV networks, for example, that are in these briefings, boycott them too. You know, there is I think, a very important role that these briefings have around the world. And yes, there are flaws with many of the press, but what Trump's done here is, I think, absolutely outrageous. And these people are right to boycott them. I mean, for example, under Obama, we had Russia Today's Gana Chichikan in the White House asking all the most awkward, difficult questions of the White House press secretaries, but they were all absolutely up to answering them. And if you start ending up with a White House press briefing where the spokespeople are not answering, or don't have the courage to answer difficult questions from press they don't agree with, then we're taking this whole business down a very, very dangerous road. And an example, this shows really that Trump is from the corporate world. Big corporations do this all the time. They exclude reporters because they don't like, and it's a way of sort of punishing certain networks if they've said something bad about that corporation. But this is totally unacceptable. You know, he's supposed to be representing 320 million Americans, not some kind of Trump Tower corporation.
Okay, well, Mr. Budowsky, Donald Trump's chief strategist, Stephen Bannon, has said that, quote, the corporatist, globalist media is adamantly opposed to an economic nationalist agenda like Donald Trump has. What do you make of that statement?
I wish we had an hour. First of all, number one, I do think there is a valid issue, setting aside Steve Bannon, with corporate concentrated ownership of media. I have been concerned about that for some time. I think from the beginning of this campaign in 2016, I publicly criticized the media for giving Donald Trump too much coverage during the Republican primaries and for not giving Bernie Sanders any coverage until he got so much popularity they had to cover him. So there is a valid concern. As far as what Bannon is saying, I don't think anybody that works for Donald Trump should be talking about corporatism from anybody else. I'll tell you that. If we had a 2-hour show, I could tell you the swamp of corporate interests that are all over the Trump presidency. And there have been too much of that under presidencies of both parties. But no, the idea that the media is out to get Trump simply isn't true. The media is out to publicize Trump because they think it's good for ratings.
Well, let me just jump in here, Mr. Budowsky. Let me just jump in here. You said that the media is definitely not out to get Trump. If we look at Donald Trump, the run-up to his actual presidency, during the election campaign, we saw some very aggressive coverage. For example, entities such as CNN, there would be 5 and 6 journalists actually interviewing someone who was pro-Trump. Do you think that that was at all a little not balanced, imbalanced, or was that just regular journalism as it has become today?
Well, that is regular journalism, for better and for worse, no doubt about it. Let me give a very specific example of how this works in the real world, in brief. Not long ago, when Michael Flynn was the president's national security advisor, he denied that he had had any conversations with the Russian ambassador about sanctions. Okay? He said he didn't do it. Everybody believed him at that point. It was then reported in the Washington Post that he did have those conversations and that they did involve sanctions, at which point he admitted he did. Vice President Pence, Trump's vice president, was angry at him for not telling the truth, and he was forced to resign. Now, if the media did not report that, did not report the fact and the truth that they did have those conversations, which Flynn was denying, he may still be in office today. So I understand why politicians can get angry at the press. Look, in brief, I work for Democratic leaders for a long part of my life, and that's like the White House staff in Congress is what I was doing. And yeah, when we didn't like what a reporter did, say from the New York Times, the way we would punish them, to be honest, is I give the next 3 stories to the Washington Post, and they would take the hint. I would never bar them from talking to us. I would never call them against America or against the people. I would never do that kind of thing. Okay. I don't believe in censorship. I don't believe in that kind of an attack, and I think Trump is going to regret it. And many Republicans, by the way, in Congress totally agree with what I'm saying right now.
Okay. Well, Tony Gosling, is this banning certain media representative an attack on democracy, or is it an attack on the global oligarchy, as some analysts are claiming?
Actually, I think it's a tantrum. And this is a bit worrying, isn't it, when you see the President of the United States kind of stamping his feet up and down saying, I don't like these people, they're not saying what I want them to say. Actually, it's really good and it's very healthy to have news outlets that are very critical of a president. I mean, it actually, in a way, Sean Spicer has walked onto the punch here, because he has come out with quite a lot of what you would call fake news, you know, facts that aren't actually facts at all. Earlier in this month, he was talking about the Iranians attacking a U.S. Navy ship. Well, it turned out it wasn't a U.S. Navy ship, and it wasn't the Iranians. Actually, it was the Houthis in Yemen attacking a Saudi ship. And that is an act of war. If it was to have been a U.S. a ship and the Iranians to attack it. So this kind of mistake, massive mistake, it does give you the impression of a kind of selfish president who is people around him and him are making things up, and when they get caught out, they have a tantrum like they're having at the moment. I agree. Next week, hopefully, what we'll see is all these news organisations allowed back, because I know what a lot of these global press organisations are like. Sometimes they do work together, and there are organisations like the Journalists Union, the Editors Unions, which will be asking a lot of questions about this and saying, well, maybe we should just boycott these press conferences until Trump actually starts to act like a proper statesman rather than a spoilt brat.
Okay, well, Brent Budowsky, Trump has basically declared war on some parts of the media. What would this mean for his administration if this continues, and what does it actually mean for those media outlets?
Well, the media outlets are doing great. They're getting more viewers and they're getting more readers, and newspaper subscriptions are up. So it's actually helping the media commercially. I think it's hurting the media by attacking their credibility, and I think it's hurting Donald Trump because his credibility goes down too. I think there will be no choice from the Trump White House but to take the advice of many Republicans and almost all Democrats and people in the media, lighten up and stop these attacks on the media. Nixon learned the hard way what happens when you do that kind of thing. The bigger issue, and this is the really important question, is on the Russia, for example, which is a big source of a lot of these controversies. What meetings did or did not happen between the Trump people and the Russians? I don't know the ultimate answer, but those answers, whatever they are, will come out. And if I were Trump, I would want that out, whatever it is, because otherwise it's going to come out over his objection, and he won't protect himself if it's bad news by attacking the media.
Well, Mr.
If it's not
Budowsky,
bad
isn't
news,
it
he
true,
helps
though?
himself.
Isn't it true, sir, that the mainstream media it sort of picks which stories they really want to concentrate on? Right now, it is this Russian issue, and possibly that they talk together during that transition period. And many would say, actually, maybe it's not a bad thing that the Russians and Americans don't go to war. But we saw, for example, during the run-up to the presidential election, we saw the whole email controversy, for example, about Hillary Clinton, that the controversy itself was concentrated on, but really the media organizations did not dig into actually what the emails were talking about. So don't we have sort of selective analysis and selective news that are covered, perhaps for agenda, by the mainstream media, or not?
Oh, no, absolutely. And look, I'm not going to defend everything that the mainstream media does. I've been very critical of it. They tend to like in the media what is shallow, what is superficial. It's not fake news, it's cheap news in many occasions. And what the media does not like generally, any media, corporate or otherwise, they don't like thoughtful, serious discussions of issues. I will say this, though, on this Russia thing, and I'm not saying what the final verdict is. I don't know the facts. Whether Russia affected an American election and spied on America, which they obviously tried to do and did on the spying, is a very big issue, as it is in France, in Germany, in Britain, and in other countries right now, where this is front-page news all over the world, the democratic world. These are big issues. The problem with the media is not that they're biased for or against Trump. At times they've been both. It's that they don't want to go in depth to serious issues. They tend to prefer the cheap and the sensational and the quick news cycle stuff where they get something on and then they beat it to death, then they go to something else, and they lack the depth of analysis that some of my media heroes, like Edward R. Murrow, the great CBS correspondent for 30 years, used to do. We need more quality and depth. And that's the problem with the media, that they don't do that enough. I try. I do my best, and there are others who do. What Trump is attacking, though, is the reporting of facts and truth because he thinks it hurts them. And then he's attacking the patriotism and integrity of journalists, and he's not going to win that fight.
Okay. Well, Tony Gosling, is this all indicative of something much bigger happening in the United States? It appears to be perhaps an overall deterioration of trust, the trust factor by the American people, much of the American system, whether we're talking about politicians, whether we're talking about the media or whatever, because in actuality, whatever he is or not, the American people has elected him as the president.
I think actually it's indicative of something much bigger, which is that the FBI, the CIA, a lot of the what you call permanent government, the people that never get elected, plus the people that own and control the press, has been used to a kind of establishment way of doing things, and Trump is stirring that up. Now, not necessarily in a good way either. I mean, a lot of people had hopes that he was going to drain the swamp. He hasn't done that at all. He's just brought lots of Goldman Sachs and other big corporations in. And I do think he's coming across as quite amateurish. Certainly no John F. Kennedy is Donald Trump. Also, the press, you know, I do agree in some ways, the press is increasingly trying to lead opinion, basically mind control millions of people, and they shouldn't be doing that. They should be reflecting opinion, and they should be doing much more investigative journalism. There's an absolute dearth of it in the West these days, nowhere near as much as there was in the 1980s. The BBC really stopped doing it in the 1990s properly. And also there is an attack on journalists generally, which this is just one part of. I mean, I myself have been excluded from press conferences in the past because I've been very critical of the people I'm trying to interrogate. I mean, we've got at the moment, Der Spiegel has just released in Germany that their security services for the last 20 years have been spying on, putting under surveillance all of the international press in Germany, which is just not acceptable. We are not to be spied on, just like MPs. We're the eyes and ears of the public. And in Britain, we've got an Espionage Act, it looks like, coming along now, which will put whistleblowers and journalists in jail for 14 years. So it's not the Islamic radicals that are taking away our civil liberties. It's our own governments.
All right, and on that note, that brings us to the end of this debate. Thanks so much to my guests for being with me from The Hill, Brent Budowsky, the columnist at The Hill from Washington, D.C., investigative journalist, Mr. Tony Gosling, out of Bristol. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. Join us same time, same place tomorrow. Marzia Hashmi signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran.